Welcome everyone to our August meeting of the Elizabeth Kahanu Hawaiian Civic Club. It has been a couple of meetings or months rather since we've had a meeting. So welcoming everyone back. And I'm very excited to welcome Susan Anthony and Chris Prone from the US guest speakers tonight, and also want to acknowledge the chair of our Economic Development Committee, as well as the chair for the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, Nohona Hawaii Committee or Hawaiian Way of Life Committee. But intellectual property rights rather has been a topic of concern for our community, and especially for the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs for the better part of, I think, the last 2 decades. I think this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Paukalani Declaration. But I think when I invited our guest speakers tonight, I mentioned that sometimes in the past when we have discussions on intellectual property rights, especially Native Hawaiian intellectual property rights, the conversations tend to be very emotional, and we don't always know how to direct our advocacy efforts. And we don't always understand, under at least the federal law and that umbrella, what recourse or what legal remedies are available to us. And so that's why I thought it was incredibly important for us tonight to invite folks from USPTO to give us some of that information. And with that, I will turn it over to Susan and Chris. Very excited to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time. And I just want to note for everyone else, it is 11:30 in DC, and we're grateful to have Susan and Chris with us at this very late hour for them. So thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
I guess I'll jump in real quick. So my name is Chris Prone. I've been with the Patent and Trademark Office for about 20 years. I'm a patent examiner. And I've been working with a lot of community outreach on the East Coast, and we're actually relocating to Hawaii, and we'd been, seeing a lot of these articles and different things and talking about it. So we thought this was a great idea to really talk to you guys directly. And Susan is our point person for anything like this with we start getting into any of the international affairs or tribal affairs. So I'll pass it off to you, Susan.
Thank you, Chris. And I will take a few minutes to explain who I am and from where I come, because I think that may help inform this conversation. It will certainly prompt questions, and we'll see how far we get. I believe you said that there would be 4 or 5 hours allotted for this meeting, and that may not be enough. That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but there's also quite a bit of truth to this. As I said, my name is Susan Anthony. I work at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and I work in a business unit that is probably not known to many of you, and perhaps not even known to Chris, and that is the Office of Policy and International Affairs. I just celebrated my 40th anniversary in the practice of law. I was a little surprised by that, but the good old Martindale Hubbell Legal Directory sent me a notice and congratulations, and I really didn't realize how many years had passed. But I started out in the practice of law in private practice, and then I worked in an international corporation, so I worked in corporate practice. And then just a little over 20 years ago, I joined the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. At some point, I was appointed as the Tribal Affairs Liaison for the USPTO, and it is a position that I have held with great pride, great honor. It is a challenge. Every single day I learn something new and I have new thoughts. I'm at home right now, but I was cleaning off my desk yesterday and I came across papers that I hadn't seen in a couple of years and was surprised at how much I have learned just in that short period of time. So what is it that I do exactly? I consider myself coming from the softer side of Sears. I do everything IP. I am an IP lawyer in everything but patents, and that is why I am particularly glad that Chris has joined us this evening. I know enough about patents to be dangerous. But I have a solid grounding in trademarks and in copyright and in protection and enforcement, US and abroad. My portfolio is very varied. It includes the domain name portfolio, also known as ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It includes work in the sub-Saharan African countries, of which there are 54 or 55, depending upon how you count. And my work there is primarily directed at trademarks and also at traditional cultural expressions. I also have done quite a bit of work with our educational arm, and we just celebrated our 10th anniversary this past summer with the National Summer Teacher Institute, or NISTE, which helps teachers K through 12 to better understand how to teach students about STEM. I like to say, with my last name being Anthony, I put the STEAM in STEM. But the work that I enjoy the most and the work that I find most challenging and which is closest to my heart is the work that I do in traditional cultural expressions and traditional knowledge. And so for most of my career at the USPTO, I have been involved in a number of matters, including one that I think is probably of great interest to the people here, and that concerns the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, specifically the Intergovernmental Committee, or IGC. And I'm going to take a moment to explain exactly what that is, because I think it probably is of interest and maybe the basis of some of your questions or our discussions. The Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Traditional Cultural Expressions set about over 20 years ago to figure out how to better protect indigenous genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. You might say, did you say over 20 years ago? And people who are counting and who have been at the table since the beginning would say, actually, that's 24, Susan. And what progress have you made? As some of you may know, this past May was a very significant development when the member states, of which there are 193, but the member states that were at the diplomatic conference on the Treaty for Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge, GRATK, actually did endorse a treaty. And the treaty actually involves a very, very simple requirement, if you will, and that is a requirement for patent disclosure in any invention that is based on genetic resources and or associated traditional knowledge. It is too early to say what the U.S. May do in response to that treaty. It's really too early to say what the world at large is going to do in response to that treaty. But it is a very significant development. It is an area that is watched very, very closely. And it is part of the work that I do. The USPTO commenced its first ever tribal consultation in January of this year. It is something that I have worked toward for many years. I was involved in the interagency working group that ultimately produced what is known as the Department of Commerce tribal consultation policy. And that policy says that the U.S. government needs to consult on policies that have tribal implications. And so we finally were able to commence those consultations, as I say, earlier this year. And the focus of that consultation was on the WIPO IGC issues writ large, not only including the diplomatic conference, but also on the two texts that remain on the table at the IGC involving traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. Those meetings will resume in December of this year and will continue into next year. And then at some point, we have to figure out, does the work get re-upped and so on and so forth. So at any rate, I think it's fair to say that there are many, many, many moving parts, whether you are talking about internationally, to some extent nationally, certainly at a tribal level, and in particular in Hawaii. And I've been to Hawaii 3 times. I've always, one time exclusively for work, the other 2 times my father and I were there, and I had occasion to do work while I was there. What the Native Hawaiian Intellectual Property Working Group is doing is something that I am watching very closely, in part because my friend Makalika Nahalawa'a is a vice chair of that group, and second, because it is it's such a very strong initiative, and I really want to see how this group works through some of the most difficult questions that peoples are facing at this time. So I think I'll just stop there, except to say that I also am a senior trademark attorney at the USPTO. So I can answer your trademark questions, some of which may be related to Native Hawaiian challenges and issues, and some of which may just be straight trademark issues. But the USPTO sits in the executive branch of the US government, and so therefore, by law, the USPTO is required to advise the administration on the full range of intellectual property, which is how I come to be speaking not only potentially this evening on trademark, but also on copyright issues, because we really do it all. So I'll just stop there, but I wanted you to know something about my background, because that could better inform the kinds of questions that you might want to ask me and Chris.
Thank you so much for that background information. And I just want to kind of start this discussion and the Q&A by saying that it was one of the resolutions that was adopted by the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, of which our club is a member, that triggered the state legislative resolution that established the Native Hawaiian Intellectual Property Working Group. So very proud to say that our fingerprints are on that work, and several of our members sit on the working group. And, you know, I can't say enough how proud I am of this work and the advocacy that the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs is doing. And with that, maybe the launching off point for the discussion and the Q&A is around kind of what I said in the introductory remarks, is whether it was the Aloha Poke, which was a shop in Chicago that put a trademark on the word poke, which is a Hawaiian word. And more recently, earlier in the summer, there was a company called Okina, which is a Hawaiian word. Okina is a Hawaiian diacritical mark. And, there was this very emotional outrage about how dare they, how can someone take part of our language and trademark it? And maybe the first question for you to respond to is, when these incidences occur, what do we do? What do you advise that, advocates either for language or just intellectual property in general, what should be our first response or reaction when these, other than that emotional response, from a policy standpoint and from a legal standpoint, what can we do when these things happen?
Well, you've asked a very powerful and a complex question. It would be beyond either me or Chris to provide specific legal advice, only general legal information. I am keenly aware of that case and followed it in the press because I too wondered what was going to happen. One of the challenges that I have heard is people wonder, how do I monitor the USPTO trademark database to find applications for marks that may offend me in some way? I think that is one of the very first challenges, and people have asked whether it would be possible to set up some sort of system that would routinely provide alerts. And unfortunately, there is no way to do that. There is no way to avoid the task which all people must undertake to search the database and to periodically and to watch developments in the database. So what is that database of which I speak? There is a database of pending applications for federal trademark registration and also for federally registered trademarks. And people who are monitoring the database either may do this themselves, or they may have watch services, outside parties for which they have to pay a fee in order for that third party to watch the database for them. The trademark records generally will indicate whether there is another language that has been used in the application. So one way, of course, to search for marks of concern would be to search for the Hawaiian language. In terms of, but that's not necessarily a guarantee, because sometimes some language may not be necessarily declared as or understood as Hawaiian, coming from the Hawaiian language. The ability to challenge is a complicated one, because there is no federal law of cultural heritage. Certainly, if you become aware of an application to which you have an objection of the mark moving to registration, or if you become aware of a trademark registration that you would seek to cancel, there is a basis for doing so under the Lanham Trademark Act, where the mark falsely suggests a connection with persons, beliefs, institutions. That's Section 2A of the Lanham Act. I don't know whether Section 2A in this instance would work or not. The reality is, I think, for many people, and I really can't take any position on the Aloha Poke matter, because it would not be appropriate for me as a member of the office to do so. But I will tell you that over time, in working with people, I think what I have seen is that people use the court of public opinion. I'm also aware that in this situation, there was a considerable hue and cry in the court of public opinion, but to my knowledge, it did not cause the Chicago company to change their business in any way. These are hard issues. And I don't want to monopolize the conversation, Chris, so if at any time you would like to step in, please do so.
I think the only thing I'd like to add is when to kind of give a perspective of the people looking at applications for patents and trademarks. So trademarks are all going to be attorneys. Patents are usually anyone with just an engineering background or a Bachelor of Science. So a lot of times like patents, we specialize in certain areas. Trademarks, they don't. So they review they could work on a trademark for like a concert coming up, and then switch to the next thing would be like a fertilizer product. So they bounce around quite a bit, and they don't necessarily have the linguistics background to always recognize, like you were saying, if it is a Hawaiian term or something like that. So I know the office is working to kind of expand their knowledge in their databases always, but there are times that it just wouldn't, if it's not drawn to their attention and it didn't come up in their research, they only have so much time to work on it. So.
One of the
Oh,
other,
well, thank you both for that.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the other issues that I recall from following the press in the Aloha Poke matter was that a number of small businesses were recipients of cease and desist letters that were very upsetting, and they were wondering what to do. Again, I'm not making any suggestion regarding that particular situation, but I do want people online to be aware that when you have an objection, there are ways to make your concerns known. Potentially through a letter of protest to the office, and certainly in an opposition proceeding or a cancellation proceeding. And I appreciate that all of that sounds complicated and potentially expensive, because while you could do these things yourself, it is inadvisable to do so because of the complexity of the issues. Sometimes, as I say, simply trying a case in the court of public opinion can be useful. I believe at some point the people who were receiving, the businesses in Hawaii that were receiving these letters, the company decided to stop sending the letters and to just allow the businesses to continue. But one of the things that always needs to be considered in any trademark case is, was I the prior user? When you look at a trademark, and a trademark is an indication of source of the goods or services to which the mark is related. If you were the first to use, you have a basis on which to stop subsequent users. But the holy grail, of course, is the federal registration. If you obtain a federal registration for a trademark through the USPTO, there is a presumption then of nationwide ownership of that mark. Otherwise, your ownership is really just localized. So if you become aware that somebody is applying to register a mark, but you are in fact the prior user, that is the time to step forward. And you might say, well, wait a minute, how prior user, that's not making a lot of sense to me. What the law seeks to do is to make sure that your proposed mark is not going to create a likelihood of confusion with the mark that is pre-existing. Trademark rights in the United States are based upon the use of the mark. Registration is not required, but as I've suggested, registration does give you certain significant benefits. So in challenging based upon your mark, you look at your mark and the proposed mark, either that's being used or that is sought to be registered, and you say, is there a likelihood of confusion? And what you're looking for is the mark that you're proposing the same as or similar to the senior user for the same or related goods or services? And I need to state that a little bit more succinctly, I guess, or clearly. When you're looking at two marks, you say, are these two marks, and I apologize, we have a thunderstorm here, so I hope I don't lose power. You're looking at two marks and you say, are these marks the same or similar? How do I determine whether marks are same or similar? if they look the same, sound the same, or mean the same. That's the first part of the test. The second part of the test is, are the goods or services the same or related? So to make it very, very easy, I'm sure that you're all aware of the Delta mark. Well, which Delta mark do I mean? Do I mean Delta for faucets? Do I mean Delta van lines that move goods? Or do I mean Delta airlines that move people? Those marks are able to coexist because even though those marks are identical, they look the same, sound the same, therefore sufficiently different goods or services. So to make a very, very long answer short, the observation is that when you become aware of somebody else that is using a mark that bothers you, you need to take a look at, are there ways in which I can claim seniority?
One thing I'd add too is when you hear trademarks, a lot of times people just think of the actual phrase, but you also want to remember that there's the four main ones. You have the word mark, which would be like just the word Coca-Cola. Then you can have a special form mark, which would be like the real curvy Coca-Cola picture that you see on the bottles. You can have a composite mark, which is going to be then a combination of both, and also even the design mark, which is like if you think of the known shape of the Coca-Cola bottle. So there's lots of different versions of the mark that can also be trademarked beyond just the actual phrase.
Thank you so much for those insights. Like, that's very helpful for us. And I think one takeaway that I have from what you've just presented is, one, I think we need to, be diligent and vigilant, right? And start to monitor more so than we have been, these databases that you've referenced. And, we have some work that we need to do just to monitor, just so we know when to, not intervene, but when to, whether it's submitting letters, like you've said, or other. But with that, I want to see if any of our other members who are on the line have any other questions along the lines of what you said about, these different marks, or other cases that I know we talked about Aloha Poke and Okina, but if there's anything else that anyone has questions about, I'll just see if anyone might have a question.
Hey, Dre, it's Shane.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's relevant to your statement, but is there any other indigenous language in the United States that has the same situation as we do with our language with trademarking and stuff? And is there a way how you guys deal with that?
Nothing immediately comes to mind, but of course, well, no, wait a minute. Let me not say that. Let me not say that. Certainly, there has been great unhappiness over the years because of applications for registrations for use of names of tribes, particularly federally recognized tribal nations. A tribal name is not exactly the same as a tribal language, and I am sure that there are challenges, just none immediately come to mind. I don't know, anything come to mind for you, Chris?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So I don't know if, to answer your question, Shane, if there's any situation analogous to the challenges for Native Hawaiians.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, because that could be helpful, I think, for us. I did have another question, but I got to stew on it a little bit, Dre, so maybe somebody else can ask.
Sure. Well, I think maybe, Shane, while you're thinking about your question, one issue that the association considered, and it was more to take a position in solidarity with other First Nations on the continent. But several years ago, and the issue has since been, I think, resolved, but we had a concern, or we shared the concern with Indian country on the Washington professional football team.
Right.
And that was trademarked. And but you know, in diving into that matter, there were concerns about, you know, the racial racist concerns around that. And so I was wondering if you might give us some insight into that and just some background, just, you know, because we're talking about, you know, other tribes or analogous situations with native languages and stuff. So is there anything that you might want to offer just on that matter?
You've certainly done your homework and you're asking us some of the most complicated questions. That was a case that I have followed all the years that I have lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years now. And you have to also remember that what the USPTO does and doesn't do. The USPTO is concerned about the registrability of trademarks. We do not get into matters of use. So you may recall that although there were favorable actions from the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board, the TTAB of the USPTO, the owner of the team at the time said, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop using that word for the team. And as you also know, there were some pressures brought on Mr. Snyder over the years, including a group of pastors, of ministers, got together and wrote a letter protesting, saying, please stop. And I think it wasn't until that he really began to feel the pinch in the pocketbook when partners said, we're going to start pulling out our monies. And that really caused a change of heart. So I think it was really a confluence of a variety of pressures. But certainly it didn't begin and end with the trademark office, because we could only say, well, there's a problem in registration. We also used to have an ability to refuse to register marks that were either disparaging and then scandalous. But both of those bases were struck down by U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And so that's no longer a tool, or those are no longer tools that you might be able to use. Going back to what you were saying earlier, what tools can we use? The ability to claim that a mark is disparaging or scandalous would have been tools that could be used, but they're no longer available to us today. So the good news is, though, we don't have that name for the team anymore. It just took a lot of time,
right,
a lot of pressure in a lot of different ways.
And I think we're all grateful for. Leilani, I saw that you unmuted, and I just wanted to see if you had a question.
Thanks. I did. I'm not sure I've thought it through well, but what I'm used to in Hawaii, we have a registration process with the DCCA. But if you register there, then it has no weight with the federal.
Right.
And so could there be a situation where somebody registers a trademark or a name in Hawaii, and then somebody else registers it federally and trumps the local one?
Well,
I just wanted to chime in really quickly. So DCCA is the Department, state agency. It's the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Ray.
the question turns on who was the first to use. And are we looking at this is the registered mark confusingly similar to the first use, your use in Hawaii? And so that's when you would use that two-part test that I talked about, whether
Okay.
the marks are the same, similar or same, and sound, what we call the sight, sound, meaning test. Do they look the same, sound the same, mean the same? And the second part of the test, whether the mark, the federally registered mark, is used for the same or related goods or services. And if the answer is yes and yes, then you have a basis on which to challenge that federal registration. If it has not yet matured to registration, then you file an opposition. If it has matured to registration, then you file a cancellation. These challenges are done generally almost exclusively on the papers. Occasionally, the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board will arrange for a hearing, but almost always it's done on the papers.
Thank you. And then a little bit related follow-up question. If the mark is not, if there's a qualifier, so for example, there's a company that named its luau the Queen's Waikiki Luau. Another company wanted to name their luau just the Queen's Luau, but the Waikiki one claimed that was their mark, and the other one could not use it, even though they weren't exactly the same. There was another word in the
Right.
middle. So, does that often come up? I mean, would it have to be
Oh, yes.
exactly the same?
No, it doesn't need to be exactly the same. All the time, the fights are about marks that are similar. But if they would be likely to cause confusion, that's when you want to say, whoa, there's a problem here.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, nobody is served. Consumers are not well served with confusingly similar marks in the marketplace. The downside, of course, and I have to say this because I have to say this every time I speak, intellectual property rights are private rights. And so it is not the government that does the enforcement, it is the owner of the right that does the enforcement. And that is something that makes people a little bit unhappy, because that may mean hiring an attorney and the like. There's something else that I want to mention to you. You'd say, well, it doesn't really apply to us, but as I'm thinking about the kinds of questions we're getting, it's and where should we go from here? You might want to take a look at the USPTO Tribal Insignia Database. And it's on the USPTO website, not difficult to find it all if you just look in our search block for insignia database. It's surely going to come right up. And what that is, and it's been on our books for more than 20 years, the idea behind it is that federally recognized and state recognized tribes are able to record their official insignia with the office. It is not the same as a trademark registration, but it does provide a very significant benefit in that the examining trademark attorney, and Chris had noted that examiners on the trademark side of the house are attorneys, will take a look at that database when they do their search to see when they're examining a new application. They'll also look at that database, and they may see that and say, there's a problem here. There's a problem of likelihood of confusion. But that doesn't end the test. Then the examiner has to say, is there a false association? So it's really a two-part test, but long-winded answer to simply say that it, I think, can be a very powerful tool. Now, whether there's any basis for developing some sort of please don't use, I have no idea. I don't know whether that's something that the Native Hawaiian IP working group would ever consider, but I just did want to mention that to you because it's out there and some tribes do use it, not as many as we would like. It's a free service and people ought to record, but I think either folks don't know about it or maybe a little hesitant because they don't fully understand what this database is about and we're the government, and I know that that is not the best. I know that's a very tense relationship for many tribes and other indigenous peoples.
Dre,
Another-
can you hear me?
You good?
Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I know. So that's a perfect segue into the question that I've had on my mind since we started this discussion. You talked about that database. Now, how does that apply to Native Hawaiians, given that Native Hawaiians do not enjoy federal recognition?
It doesn't. And that's what I was trying to. I'm getting reverberation. I don't know why. And that's what I was trying to say is I appreciate that it doesn't apply to Native Hawaiians. And it is at this time only for federally recognized and state recognized tribes. But I merely note it as a tool and that perhaps there is some thought to be given there as to what other kinds of initiatives or tools could be introduced to help address the challenge that was noted at the outset of this conversation of why are our Native Hawaiian words being included in non-Native Hawaiian trademarks. So I didn't mean to suggest, Mr. Lee, that it was available to you to use. I was just noting it as an example of a tool that perhaps could be explored for whatever it is worth.
Thank you. I have a follow-up because you also mentioned state recognized. The state of Hawaii does recognize Native Hawaiians as the indigenous people of this land. So that being said, would we then be able to avail ourselves of that because we are recognized by the state of Hawaii as the indigenous people?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I hadn't thought about that. And I think that is worth your further exploration. The question would be, though, of course, remember what that database is all about. It's about the tribes submit their official insignia for recordation. And so the question would be, well, what's an official insignia? I don't know the answer to that question either. That really is for any one tribe to determine what is their official insignia. And obviously any one tribe could have several official insignia, far more than one. There's no cost to recording, so I don't see it as a downside to record as many as you can. But it's a very interesting question, Mr. Lee, and I think that's something that you'll want to further explore.
I think while we have the state recognition, we don't have for lack of a better term, a governing entity, like a formal governing entity, but definitely something for us to consider and think about, for future. And maybe this is something that the Native Hawaiian Intellectual Property Working Group can consider in their work. But Kaleana, great question. Kind of along those lines, there has been some consideration, and one of the members on the call might have more information. I just don't know if she's available to ask the question, but I think we've seen maybe internationally with other indigenous groups in a concept of a collective mark, right?
Oh,
Where
yes.
artists or practitioners might have a mark noting that their product or their art is indigenous made, or I think you see where we're going. So
I
what
do.
under federal law is available for maybe a native Hawaiian mark for our cultural practitioners and our artists and artisans to maybe consider. And I'll
Well,
just acknowledge, Malia, if you can unmute and if you want to add anything to the question, definitely go ahead. And I understand if you're not available to ask a question, maybe Susan, you could go. But
I think she's going to
just wanted
ask the
to
question.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm
Go ahead,
parked.
Malia.
I'm parked. Yeah, mahalo, Dre. Yeah, it's something I've been talking about with Dre a lot because I recently attended a training at White Pole with other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, and part of our 1 year work with them is to
Yes.
look at either our own trademark that we would create for our businesses, or like, and we learned about collective marks. And that, you know, I love to see, like here on Kauai, because I live on Kauai, we have a made in Kauai trademark that the county oversees. And so I've really been interested in doing one for Lauhala weavers to, you know, and then we would put the rules together for that. Like,
Right.
one, I'm interested in like marking the mark would tell you, one, you're a native Hawaiian weaver. Number two, the lauhala itself is gathered here in Hawaii, because there's so much that's being like imported from other Pacific Island countries. And so I think it's important, you know, for the consumer to really know where these items are coming from. And so some weavers they're supportive, but like my own teacher, she doesn't want me to go down that path, you know. And so I told the WIPO friends, I still need to have conversations and build an understanding and education in our community so that we all know like really what this trademark is helping us do to inform the consumer. And so I don't know, that's kind of what I've been sharing with Dre of what I would like to work on, and haven't started the process, but yeah, would love your thoughts on that.
Gosh, you've come to the right place and I've come to the right place. I would certainly be glad at any time to meet with your group. I wish I could come right there, but we may have to do it online. But I would be glad to discuss trademark, collective mark, and certification mark. One of the examples that comes to mind, because it's very interesting, for almost all of those 20 years that I've been with the office, I've also been working with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board at the Department of Interior. And as you know, there is an Indian Arts and Crafts Act. And as you also know, there's a question as to could this be expanded to include others? But as you also know, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is a false advertising act. So one of the things that I have been thinking about is what could be done to help better preserve and promote traditional and contemporary arts and crafts of all Indigenous peoples based in the US. And it's interesting. There really aren't marks, certification marks, or collective marks related to that area or to those works. I'm not quite sure why. I think part of it is just the challenge of education. Several years ago, my counterpart and friend at the Indian Arts and Crafts Board and I met with several tribes, and one tribe was very interested in pursuing a certification mark for their traditional and contemporary arts and crafts. Some matters absolutely unrelated to this impeded the tribe's focus in moving forward. But one of the great challenges I could see that was percolating up in that room when we had these discussions was trying to define those standards to which you just referred, about How does a community set an appropriate level of standards? How do you address the situation that sometimes people say, well, I'm of this community, so I should automatically be allowed to use the certification mark. If that's the direction in which you want to go, then maybe you use a collective mark, like Blackfeet Nation uses Blackfeet logo for its jewelry and arts and crafts. So these are complicated questions. I'd be very interested in knowing why your teacher is very hesitant about you going down this route, because it does make very good sense to me. One of the examples that comes to my mind, because I am a knitter, is the Cowichan sweater. I don't know if that immediately brings to mind the sweater, but I know if you saw the sweater, you'd say, oh, I don't know the name of it, but I know that's a certain kind of sweater. So the Cowichan sweater, and it wouldn't be too relevant in Hawaii, but as you travel around, you certainly have reason to see it. Is a very heavy sweater made out of very heavy yarn that traditionally came from dogs. As I recall the story, it's been a while since I knew it, but came from dogs, and that it was combed and spun, and the yarn was made, and the only members of the coastal Salish people could develop the patterns and knit the sweaters. As you also can appreciate, that was knocked off in a very big way. And so today, the coastal Salish people have certification marks in Canada for their Cowichan sweaters. And I think it's a success story, but it took a very long time to get there, and they faced some of the same challenges to which you were just alluding. So I know we're close in time. I don't have a need to rush off, but and I'm just fine. I get on a roll and then you can't shut me up. But I'm always glad, if you want to convene a group, of course I have to go, and Chris has to go through all these, approvals to be able to speak, but they're generally forthcoming, and it can easily be done through a webinar. And I can certainly walk you through what's involved in protecting your mark, either as a trademark or a collective mark or a certification mark, and the kinds of advantages that could be gleaned. I do think that the Cowichan sweater certification marks in Canada are a great success story, but they went through all the hard, tough, lousy things, knockoffs and the like, to get there. So I would like to think that their mark has helped raise the visibility of the mark and of the related goods of the sweaters, and maybe makes people say, oh gosh, well, all right, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't copy that. That's somebody's something.
Mhm. Yeah, mahalo. I think one of the reasons why my kumu is hesitant is when one of the rules I've kind of laid out that's important to me is I would like it to be connected to a Native Hawaiian weaver. And she feels like many of her peers, and she's Native Hawaiian, but her others that are at her level of expertise of lauhala weaving are also non-Hawaiians who learn directly from a Hawaiian kupuna, an elder. So she's hesitant that it'll like create a divide. And I
Right.
told her that's not my intention. The intention is really to let the consumer know. And if it's because I know when I travel to Aotearoa or Australia or something, I actually look for these trademarks, and
Yes, I do
I
too. I do
know
too.
I
Yeah.
go straight to that vendor and I'm be
That
like, I'm
right.
shopping in this store because this store has all items that are from, and it marked, the store is marked. And I just love that, it informs me as a consumer. And that's what I want to be able to do, is inform a consumer. If these are the like standards that you want to support and put your money towards, then that's where you go. And I think that's what I want, like, people to know, like, trademarks can be that kind of a tool to inform the consumer. So anyways, that's like what goes on in my mind.
Well, no, I think that's great. And as to should somebody who is non-Hawaiian be allowed to use the mark? That's a question that the community would need to decide. And it would be reflected in the standards. For example, I'm just making this up. I obviously have no knowledge, but that a non-Hawaiian who has been trained in the following ways and has achieved the following levels of mastery would be permitted to use a certification mark. Because in a mark, whether you're talking about a trademark, a collective mark, a certification mark, you always have to engage in what I call the care and feeding of your mark. You always have to make sure that it is properly used. Now, once you set the certification mark standards, then anybody who meets those standards is able to use the certification mark. But it takes a lot of work to continue to monitor to make sure that those who are using the mark, in fact, continue to meet the certification mark standards. Thank you so much for your question. It's very exciting.
Thank you. I could go on and on too, but I'll stop
Well,
there.
you and I, we'll just talk until,
Well, we will make sure that you two are connected so you can continue this discussion. But I am wondering if we can circle back to Shane and maybe one last question and see if Shane, who by the way is also a weaver, Shane, did you figure out your question yet?
No, I think in a discussion I figured it out. But yeah, I'm good, Dre. Thank you. But yeah, Malia, I think you should pursue that. It's like Kona coffee, it's like other things, and it creates good definition for product. I like that. Yeah.
Well, I think you're
Thank you, Shane.
absolutely right.
Okay,
I
well,
do
with
think
that, I
I'm
do want
sorry.
to. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I do believe that trademarks is, I won't say it's the only tool, but it is perhaps the most powerful tool, because when you look at traditional cultural expressions, for example, patents don't fit, trade secrets definitely don't fit, copyright almost never fits. So what do you have that's left? That is, of course, a critical question in today's world. What is the basis for tribal protection or Native Hawaiian or for any indigenous communities protection of their genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions? There are those who would say that if this intangible cultural property is not subject to Western IP law, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and copyrights, then the intangible cultural property is in the public domain, meaning that anybody can use it. That is the big central battle today. These are the hard questions at which the WIPO IGC is looking internationally. I am very excited to see that the Native Hawaiian IP Working Group is looking at these questions for Hawaii. And I'm kind of hoping that the work, which I know they're moving very rapidly at this point. They met in June. They've got to produce a report sometime in November in preparation for the 2025 legislature. They're moving fast, but I am very hopeful. I pray that their work will be a template, if you will, about how things could be done moving forward.
Susan, thank you so much. And with that, I do want to thank you, Susan and Chris, for joining us, especially at the late hour that it is in DC. But I think we've been armed with some very good education and information. And I will also remind our members on the call that the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs resolutions deadline is September 15th. So we have a couple of weeks based on this information that we've learned and heard today, where we can formulate resolutions that the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs at our annual convention in November can consider and will debate. And it's the resolutions for Susan and Chris that become the advocacy platform for our organization. So thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Susan, we'll connect you and Malia together to continue the discussion on the collective mark. And with that, I cannot thank you enough for the time you've given us. And thank you to our members for logging on. And for our members who are going to watch this recording at a future date, so much great information, so much good, just seeds being planted that we can think of and reconnect with the Native Hawaiian IP group. So thank you very much. Everyone have a good evening. If you are driving, drive safely. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening and thank you again. Ahui ho,
Thank you.
aloha.
Thank you. Thank you. Aloha.
Yep. Aloha.
Mahalo.